All throughout the church, there have been men and women who have discerned a particular vocation, a calling, to really orient their lives and their schedules and their wealth and their possessions, really their love, around the intentional pursuit of deeply joining themselves to the love of God and allowing God to join them to His mission out into the world. And from about the 3rd century on, there have been men and women who have oriented their lives around a really basic idea, but one that more or less takes a lifetime of attention, and it's this. This is the idea: that God's primary disposition towards us is His love for us, and that God's primary desire is that we might become recipients of His love, which God Himself is pouring out into the world in an ongoing way. So these men and women who oriented their lives around this conviction, they eventually began to form communities and movements around the practice of participating with God's work in us, His work of formation and healing and birthing love in us. And these communities, as they got more integrated and connected into the life of the church, into the life of the institution of the church, they eventually built beautiful monasteries, and the movements that were birthed from these communities lived a set of shared practices and commitments, like service to the poor and simple practices of hospitality, commitments to praying the scriptures and studying and having spiritual conversations with people both within the faith and outside of it. And these religious orders, some of which you've probably heard of, the Franciscans and the Dominicans and the Society of Jesus, founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola, and even Mother Teresa's community, the Sisters of Charity, all of these are rooted in more or less the same basic idea: that we have been invited into participation with God in His ongoing work of creation of us. And with the empowerment by the Spirit and the presence of God Himself, God's love in us is teaching us how to love as God loves. This is what they shared in common. But each of these orders has also taken on a unique task, a particular way of serving alongside of God's mission, and this is often referred to as a charism. In the Order of the Common Life, we believe that our charism, our work, is to notice and nurture the work of God. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through reimagining this entire tradition from within inside of it. We're reimagining what has historically been called religious vocations, such that people like you and me, people living in the world as parents and priests and shopkeepers and business executives, can sort of be folded into the same tradition occupied by St. Augustine and St. Ignatius and Benedict. So we're reimagining religious vocations for the 21st century, and it's within this tradition that we want to invite you into a journey with the Order of the Common Life, a religious order for the 21st century. If you are at all a bit curious, this video continues with a little bit more context and a really specific invitation. One of my favorite classes in 4th grade was art class, and one of my favorite art teachers was my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Nagel. And the art that I most remember from grade school was when we brought out the paper mache. I don't know if you remember doing this in grade school, but we would wear one of our dad's old work shirts buttoned up in the back so we didn't make a mess. But in paper mache, you generally have 3 things. You've got glue, paper, and some sort of form that you will be laying the paper over. So in our art class, we used balloons and chicken wire. Really, you can use anything that would allow the paper to drape over it. And the idea behind paper mache is that the paper would take on the shape of whatever it was that it was draped over. And eventually it would dry and the glue would hold everything together. So this is one of the images that I'd like for you to hang on to, because this is one of the ways that we like to talk about the form or the shape of our lives. I think most people who are trying to follow in the way of Jesus as an apprentice to the teachings and the way that Jesus lived, most people that I interact with have a hard time sorting out the rhythms of their life and the practices that they take on and the structure of their days and weeks in a way that can really support the work that God is doing in their life. And what men and women have done throughout this monastic tradition and the tradition that has given us the religious orders, particularly in the Catholic Church, what they've done is they've recognized that there are so many things that tend to draw us away from the work that God is doing in us. There's so many things distracting us from being able to fully receive the love of God that He is pouring into our lives. The way that we live our lives, the structure, the rhythms, the practices of our life, these can either support or get in the way of the work of God in us. Maybe there's a couple things that are coming to your mind right now. So going all the way back to the 4th century, communities of men and women, they began to live in a way that provided and practiced support in community. And as they began to write down their shared and common commitments, commitments to things like prayer and study and work, for example, this written document became known as that community's form of life. They were giving their life together some shape, some sort of form, something over which they could sort of lay their lives so that Christ might be formed in them and that they might be able to more fully receive the love of God, that they could create room in their life and a shape to their life. Now, another way that they talked about their way of life together or their form of life, particularly as this began to be written down, is they began to talk about it as a rule of life. This is probably language that you might be familiar with. It's beginning to sort of make its way into how people think about what it means to take on intentional practices in following the way of Jesus. But a rule of life is the same thing as the shape of one's life. It's just another metaphor. It's another way of describing really the same thing that we talked about when we talked about paper mache. So here's another image. If I were to set out to make some clothes, if I were like crafty enough to make my own shirt, I would get a piece of material and I would get a pattern and I would make some measurements. And at some point, I would need to lay that cloth up against a ruler, which is an agreed upon standard and point of reference for measuring things. So if the pattern said 15 centimeters, then I would lay that piece of cloth up against something that I know is 15 centimeters in order to get my measurement. A rule of life is just like that. If you had in your mind the kind of life that you wanted, the kind of life in God that you wanted, of prayer and of solitude and of silence, of some outward expression of your faith that would include serving others and praying for others, and you sat down and determined the shape of your life, the practices that you wanted to lean into as a way of shifting the focus of your attention on your life with God into particular ways, you would then have something to sort of lay your life next to see how the way your life is unfolding is or isn't actually lining up with how you want your life to unfold. The question that we're always asking with a rule of life is this: is the shape of my life, is the way that I spend my days, my habits and my practices, do they reflect the life that I have discerned as the kind of life that I actually want to live? And listen, if they don't, if your life doesn't actually match up to how you want it to be, that's okay. Like, a rule of life is not meant to create a life lived towards perfection, but rather it's meant to help create a life that is lived into a particular direction with some intention. So religious orders all throughout history are really just people who are coming together and deciding that these particular practices, these particular commitments, these are the things that we can all commit to together. These are the things that we want to give shape, not only to our lives as individuals, but to our life as a community, as we pursue together a life that is open to the love of God. So we want to invite you to consider and apply for our 6-month-long cohort that we've designed to lead you alongside of other people in a process of discernment around our shared rule of life, and really to explore how being a part of a community of people who are practicing together might support the work of God's outpouring love in and through your life. So the rule of life for the order of the common life is called invitations and commitments. simply because what it's designed to do is to extend to you an invitation around a rhythm of life that supports prayer and work and study and rest, and 12 commitments that we've drawn from historic monasticism and the broad witness of religious orders. And beginning in January of each year, we start cohorts that are designed to lead you through both the historic understanding of these rhythms and commitments, some theological understanding for what it means for us to lean into this way of life together. But most importantly, what this cohort is designed to do is it's designed to offer about 24 weeks of personal reflection on how God might invite you to personally consider the rhythms and the commitments within our shared rule of life. So the cohort is called Postulancy, and it's called Postulancy because it comes from a traditional Latin term that means to ask. Our Postulancy cohort is designed to help you ask and attend to one simple question. Am I being invited by God to enter into this particular way of life? To help me become unhindered from the things that stand in the way of growing in my capacity to receive the love of God. So friends, we would love to take you on this journey with us. Much love and blessings to you.